You think Hollywood pushes boundaries? Europe has been blowing up the rulebook since the first projector flickered to life. Some movies didn't just rattle audiences, they made entire governments panic. Bans, riots, court cases, even burned film reels. These aren't urban legends, they're real. What film could be so dangerous it was smuggled across borders in secret, or so outrageous it landed its director in court? Get ready, because what you're about to hear will make you rethink what too far really means. Salo, or The 120 Days of Sodom, 1975. Some movies get called disturbing. Salo laughs at the word disturbing. Pier Paolo Pasolini's last film is notorious for one simple reason. Almost nobody gets through it without looking away. Inspired by a 200-year-old novel, Pasolini transformed a story of aristocratic depravity into a gut punch that left audiences reeling. Imagine this, a group of elite sadists rounding up teenagers in fascist Italy and turning a remote mansion into a living nightmare. That's not just a plot, that's the blueprint for one of the most banned films ever made. Screenings sparked protests, police raids, and lawsuits. In Italy, censors sliced out entire reels and still couldn't stomach it. France and the UK banned it outright. Australia said, no way. The US, only art theaters dared to show it, usually with warnings that sounded more like dares. What made Salo radioactive wasn't just its violence or the horrors inflicted on screen. It was the cold, unblinking way Pasolini filmed everything. There's no music to soften the impact. No good guys to root for, just a grim procession of cruelty and humiliation that makes most horror movies look tame. For decades, governments treated Salo like a virus. Critics called it depraved and unwatchable, yet others hailed it as essential art. Today, it sits on almost every list of the most disturbing movies ever made. Love it or hate it, nobody leaves Salo unchanged. A Clockwork Orange, 1971. When Stanley Kubrick adapted Anthony Burgess's novel, he didn't just make a film, he started a culture war. A Clockwork Orange. Storm is all about violence, chaos, and mind games. The visuals were wild, the dialogue was slang-heavy, and the soundtrack blared classical music over scenes nobody could forget. The movie's release turned London into ground zero for outrage. Newspapers screamed that it was corrupting youth, inspiring copycat attacks, and ruining morals. Politicians demanded bans. Even Kubrick's own family started getting threats. The film was banned in several countries, but the real shocker? Kubrick himself asked for it to be pulled from UK theaters. He didn't want any more violence linked to his name, and the studio agreed. For nearly 30 years, British audiences couldn't legally see A Clockwork Orange. Importing or screening it could land you in trouble. The film became legend, a forbidden fruit for a generation raised on rumors and whispered stories about its content. In Europe, bans and censorship were everywhere. Ireland said no. Sweden cut entire scenes. Italy freaked out. The controversy only grew as home video took off and bootleg tapes circulated. When the ban was finally lifted in the UK in 2000, younger viewers found it less shocking, but nobody could deny the power. It's the rare film that changed not just what was allowed on screen, but how society talks about movies themselves. Cannibal Holocaust, 1980. Some films don't just cross the line, they drag the line so far, nobody can find it again. Cannibal Holocaust is that kind of movie. Director Ruggero Deodato set out to make the ultimate jungle horror film and wound up with one of the most infamous bans in cinema history. It's a fake documentary about an American film crew disappearing in the Amazon, and what gets found is a collection of footage so raw and convincing, people actually thought it was real. Here's how wild things got. After its premiere in Milan, Italian authorities arrested Deodato for suspected murder. The court demanded he prove the actors were still alive. He did, and the charges were dropped, but that didn't slow down the avalanche of bans. The UK's infamous Video Nasties list. Cannibal Holocaust was at the top. Australia banned it too. Norway, Germany, and several other countries followed suit. Even now, it's illegal or heavily censored in many places. What made it so shocking? The violence felt real. The filmmaking style was raw and unpolished, making everything look like genuine news footage. Some scenes were staged with a level of detail that fooled audiences and censors alike. Critics called it a new low, while horror fans passed around bootleg copies, daring each other to sit through the whole thing. 4 decades later, Cannibal Holocaust still holds its reputation. It's either a horror classic or a line that should never have been crossed, depending on who you ask. Irreversible, 2002. When Irreversible premiered at Cannes, people didn't just walk out. They ran for the exits. Gaspar Noé's film took a simple story of revenge and spun it in reverse, showing the aftermath of violence before revealing the events that led to it. The camera work was dizzying, the soundtrack was punishing, and the performances by Monica Bellucci and Vincent Cassel left audiences shaken. What really shocked viewers wasn't just the filmmaking, it was the raw, relentless brutality. Irreversible pushed the boundaries so hard that entire countries said, enough. Italy and Norway banned or heavily censored it. Even in France, the debate was fierce. Critics were split. Was it groundbreaking art or a step too far? The film became a lightning rod for debate, with some calling it one of the most important French films of the decade, and others demanding it be pulled from theaters entirely. Noé himself didn't seem to care about the controversy. He said he wanted to make a film you couldn't just watch and forget. Mission accomplished. The film's structure, playing out in reverse order, forces you to sit with every consequence before you know what caused it. That's part of what makes it so haunting. Even years later, Irreversible is remembered as a cinematic dare. See it once, and you'll never shake the memory. Baise-moi 2000. Few films have set off a firestorm quite like Baise-moi. Released in 2000, this French crime drama exploded onto screens with a story about two women on a violent rampage after facing brutal injustice. But what happened on screen wasn't the only thing that had everyone talking. The movie's unfiltered style and refusal to play by any rules made it the subject of fierce debate across Europe. French censors reacted by slapping it with a rare X rating, the kind usually reserved for the most extreme content. That decision triggered protests from artists and critics who claimed the film was being unfairly targeted. But other countries weren't so diplomatic. Norway banned it outright. Australia followed suit. Even in France, the controversy dragged on for years, with some theaters refusing to screen it and court battles popping up over whether it should be allowed at all. What set Baise-moi apart was its fearless, anything-goes attitude. It didn't sugarcoat anything. Instead, directors Virginie Despentes and Coralie Trinity delivered a road movie that felt like a punch in the gut. Raw camera work, jumpy editing, and a relentless pace made sure you never felt comfortable for a second. Some called it a feminist rallying cry. Others saw it as pure provocation. Either way, the movie forced people to confront questions about what's acceptable in art and what crosses the line. Love it or hate it, Baise-moi is still one of the most talked about French films of the new century. The Last Temptation of Christ, 1988. Here's a movie that set Europe ablaze before it even opened. Martin Scorsese's The Last Temptation of Christ wasn't just a film, it was an international incident waiting to happen. Adapted from a novel, the movie tackled themes most directors wouldn't touch with a 10-foot pole. And the backlash, swift, loud, and in some countries, downright dangerous. Protesters lined up outside theaters in France and Italy, waving signs and chanting for bans. Local governments in parts of both countries caved to public pressure, pulling the film from theaters or refusing to license it altogether. The reaction in Greece was even harsher. Lawmakers banned it before the first ticket was sold, and some cinemas that dared to show it anyway faced threats and attacks. The uproar made headlines worldwide. What's wild is that most people debating the film hadn't even seen it. Scorsese wasn't out to offend, he wanted to explore doubt, faith, and temptation. But for many, just the idea was enough. The controversy gave the movie a reputation far beyond its box office. Suddenly, everyone wanted to know what was so shocking that entire countries wanted it erased from screens. Over the years, the bans have faded, but the legend has only grown. Even now, it's remembered as the film that proved one thing. In Europe, sometimes just asking the big questions is enough to get your movie blacklisted. In the Realm of the Senses, 1976. Few films have been smuggled through customs with the same urgency as In the Realm of the Senses. Officially a Japanese production, it was funded and released by a French company, making it one of the most controversial imports Europe has ever seen. The story, based on a real-life case of obsession in 1930s Tokyo, wasn't just boundary pushing. It ran straight through every line set by European censors. When it premiered in France, the reaction was immediate. Police raided theaters, reels vanished, and government officials scrambled to figure out what to do with a film so explicit, so intense, it left audiences stunned. The movie was banned or heavily censored in France, Germany, and the UK. Customs officials even seized prints at airports, trying to keep them from ever being shown. What set this film apart wasn't just the subject matter, but how director Nagisa Oshima handled it. Raw, hypnotic, and completely unflinching. Every scene dared viewers to look away, and plenty did. In Italy and Spain, authorities tried to block any screening, calling it a threat to public order. Critics argued it was a work of art, not a cheap shocker, but most countries only saw trouble. Despite the bans, In the Realm of the Senses found an audience among cinephiles and underground theaters. Today, it stands as a symbol of how far filmmakers and those who love challenging cinema will go to defend freedom of expression, even when it means going up against the entire system. The Devils, 1971. If ever a film was built to cause panic, Ken Russell's The Devils was it. The ingredients, outrage, spectacle, and a true story about power gone mad. Russell took the tale of a 17th century priest accused of witchcraft and transformed it into a nightmarish vision of paranoia and hysteria that made even the censors flinch. When it hit UK theaters, the reaction was instant and explosive. The British Board of Film Classification demanded massive cuts, and some scenes were lost for decades. But even the trimmed version sent shockwaves through the public. Protests erupted. Politicians blasted the film for undermining moral order. The Vatican issued a condemnation. In France and Italy, entire cities banned it. In Finland and Norway, it vanished from theaters entirely. What rattled everyone so badly? Russell's direction was hallucinatory, flashing between gothic horror and wild surrealism. There were no safe spaces, no comfort zones. The film ripped through sacred cows, authority figures, and every social taboo it could find. The result? A movie that seemed to set fire to the screen itself. Decades later, The Devils is still infamous, partly because you still can't see the full uncut version in most countries. It's a legend of censorship, a reminder that sometimes what's most dangerous about a film isn't the violence or the outrage, but the fearless way it forces people to face their own boundaries. Love Camp 7, 1969. Sometimes a film is so controversial that it's not just banned, it's erased from existence in whole countries. Love Camp 7, a British-Italian production, hit screens in 1969 and immediately found itself on the wrong side of censors all over Europe. The plot: American agents infiltrate a German prison camp during World War II, hoping to rescue prisoners and sabotage the enemy. Sounds like routine war movie stuff until the movie goes off the rails. From the first reel, it's clear this isn't your grandfather's war film. The movie's blend of harsh content and exploitation quickly earned it a reputation as a cinematic powder keg. British censors said no. Ireland banned it. Norway followed suit. Today, the film is still illegal to own or distribute in the UK, making it one of the few movies to remain on the country's banned list for decades. What's wild is that, outside of the controversy, hardly anyone has actually seen it. Bootleg tapes circulate among collectors, but for the most part, Love Camp 7 lives in legend. Critics called it trash. Censors called it dangerous, and historians point to it as the start of a wave of controversial movies that would test the limits of European censorship. More than 50 years later, the film's reputation hasn't faded. It remains a touchstone for anyone who wants to understand just how far European authorities would go to keep certain images out of public view. Pink Flamingos, 1972. If you think moviegoers are hard to shock, you haven't seen what happened when Pink Flamingos landed in Europe. John Waters' underground classic is famous for one thing: gleeful, unapologetic shock value. When Divine and her oddball crew first strutted onto the screen, European censors hit the panic button so fast you'd think the film was a national threat. The UK was quick to ban it, refusing classification and making it illegal to screen or even own in the country for years. Norway, Switzerland, and Australia followed, slamming the door on Waters' parade of bad taste. Authorities didn't just object to the wild characters and out there storylines. They were convinced the movie itself was a kind of social hand grenade. For decades, Pink Flamingos was whispered about in the same breath as forbidden books or dangerous political tracks. What's crazy is how the ban only made the legend bigger. Fans smuggled bootleg VHS tapes across borders, holding secret screenings that felt more like protests than movie nights. Waters, for his part, leaned into the chaos, calling the film an act of art terrorism. Decades later, Pink Flamingos is recognized as a milestone in cult cinema, but it's also a case study in how a movie can scare the establishment for all the wrong or maybe the right reasons. Even today, it's a reminder. Sometimes the most shocking thing about a film is the freedom it demands. Matador, 1986. Long before Pedro Almodovar became a household name, he set off alarms across Europe with Matador. This was no glossy Spanish drama. It was a wild, unpredictable ride through obsession, violence, and the dark side of human nature. When the film debuted, the reaction was swift. Spanish authorities cut scenes, critics argued, and other countries debated whether it was too much for their audiences to handle. Set in the world of retired bullfighters and twisted passions, Matador was the movie that proved Almodovar wasn't interested in playing it safe. Instead, he delivered a film that felt like a fever dream, hallucinatory, intense, and impossible to look away from. Spanish censors demanded edits for its blend of intense imagery and raw themes. In Ireland, the film faced an outright ban. Other countries quietly cut sections or limited screenings to late-night adult audiences. The controversy became part of the movie's DNA. Almodovar, never one to shy from the spotlight, argued the film was about confronting our own fears and instincts. Critics either loved it or called it a provocation too far. What's certain is that Matador forced a conversation about what kind of stories Spain and the rest of Europe were willing to tell on screen. Today, it's seen as an essential chapter in European cinema history, not just for its audacity, but for how it helped launch a director who would go on to challenge and redefine the rules of film around the world. Antichrist, Denmark, 2009. Lars von Trier has never been shy about stirring the pot, but with Antichrist, he practically boiled it over. This Danish psychological horror film showed up at Cannes and immediately split the audience into two camps, those who stormed out and those who couldn't look away. Von Trier's signature style, moody visuals, relentless tension, and disturbing imagery pushed every boundary. The reaction in Europe was wild. French and Spanish censors demanded cuts or slapped on severe age restrictions. Italy's film board briefly banned it outright, while other countries only allowed limited screenings with heavy warnings attached. Critics wrote pages about the film's style, but most of the buzz was about what viewers could barely handle. Many theaters refused to show it, arguing it was just too much for mainstream audiences. What makes Antichrist so unforgettable is the way it dares the viewer to stick it out until the end. The story, about a grieving couple unraveling in a remote cabin, seems simple, but Von Trier's direction turns it into a slow-motion train wreck of dread and chaos. Even hardcore film fans were left reeling. Over a decade later, the movie is still cited as one of Europe's most controversial. Whether you think it's a work of art or a dare gone wrong, there's no denying it. Antichrist is a film that leaves a scar, and that's exactly how Von Trier wanted it. Battle Royale, 2000. Sometimes a film is so ahead of its time, the world has to catch up or run scared. Battle Royale, a Japanese production, lit up Europe with its chilling vision of teenagers forced into a deadly competition on a deserted island. The story is simple. Only one can survive, and the rest, well, you get the idea. But the execution was so intense that European censors saw red. Germany and the UK put the film under a microscope, with calls for outright bans or severe editing. France, already reeling from debates about violence in media, kept the film away from young audiences for years. The timing was brutal. In the wake of real-life tragedies and school violence, Battle Royale was quickly labeled dangerous, too raw, too real, too much. Ironically, the outrage made the film legendary among young viewers, who traded copies and quoted lines in secret. Directors and critics called it a wake-up call for a society hooked on reality TV and competition. Authorities called it a public menace. The result? Years of controversy, followed by grudging respect as the movie's influence spread to Hollywood and beyond. Today, Battle Royale stands as both a warning and a touchstone. A film that didn't just get banned, it changed how Europe thought about youth, media, and just how far a story can go before the world says, enough. The 1970s was a decade where cinema went completely off the rails. Forget playing it safe, these movies dared to shock, dared to offend, and dared to leave you squirming in your seat. They weren't polished Hollywood productions built for family outings. They were raw, defiant, and designed to hit like a gut punch. So, what happens when a filmmaker decides rules don't matter anymore? You're about to see. And trust me, some of these choices still feel outrageous decades later. Women in Cages, 1971. Imagine being dropped into a jungle prison with no hope of escape and no sense of justice. That's the world Roger Corman handed to audiences with women in cages. Shot in the Philippines to slash costs, this film introduced Pam Grier in one of her earliest roles, and she didn't play the hero. She played the ruthless warden, strutting through the prison with an iron grip and a cold stare that made every scene tense. At the time, audiences had never seen anything quite like it. The setup was simple: a group of women thrown behind bars in a corrupt foreign system where survival meant adapting or breaking. What set it apart was how it blended exotic jungle backdrops with the claustrophobia of confinement. Grier's character embodied authority gone wrong, and critics who dismissed the film as exploitation couldn't ignore her commanding presence. The production itself was just as wild as the story. Filmed on location in sweltering heat, the cast endured grueling conditions while trying to deliver performances that felt gritty and real. The handheld camera work gave it a documentary-like vibe, making the intensity harder to brush off. While mainstream critics turned their noses up, grindhouse audiences couldn't get enough. It was loud, messy, and unapologetically brash. In hindsight, Women in Cages showed the power of casting. Without Grier, it might have been another low-budget entry lost in the shuffle. With her, it became a landmark, the women in prison wave that flooded theaters through the decade. Love it or hate it, the film proved audiences were willing to pay for boldness, even when it made them uncomfortable. That's the exact energy that kept 70s exploitation alive. The Big Dollhouse, 1971. If Women in Cages cracked the door open, The Big Dollhouse blew it right off its hinges. Also shot in the Philippines under Roger Corman's watch, this film didn't just ride the women in prison trend, it defined it. Once again, Pam Grier stormed onto the screen, this time as a fellow prisoner caught up in the chaos of rebellion. Her performance made her a superstar, and the movie's blend of jungle grit and prison intensity became the formula countless imitators copied. The story was raw and straightforward. Inside the prison, the inmates endured brutal treatment until they decided they'd had enough. What followed was an explosive plan to fight back, wrapped in sweat, tension, and the kind of energy that only comes from a low-budget film where everyone is giving 100%. The jungle itself became a character, its humid, unforgiving atmosphere seeping into every frame. Behind the scenes, the conditions were tough. Shooting in the Philippines meant real heat, real bugs, and real exhaustion. But those challenges gave the movie its edge. It didn't feel staged. It felt like you were right there in the mud and smoke with the characters. Critics dismissed it as cheap thrills, but audiences lined up because it delivered exactly what the posters promised: rebellion and raw intensity. What really made The Big Dollhouse stand out was its energy. The pacing never slowed, the confrontations were relentless, and the finale left viewers stunned. It wasn't polished, but that was the point. In a decade where mainstream cinema was beginning to experiment, exploitation films like this one were already running wild, daring audiences to keep up. For many fans, it remains the ultimate entry in the women in prison cycle, proof that grit and nerve can sometimes outshine big budgets. Sweetback's Baise-moi, 1971. Every once in a while, a film doesn't just entertain, it detonates like a cultural bomb. That's exactly what Melvin Van Peebles unleashed with Sweetback's Baise-moi. Independent to the core, this movie was made outside the Hollywood system, shot guerrilla style with a skeleton crew, and released on Van Peebles' own terms. It wasn't just a film, it was a declaration of independence for an entire generation of black filmmakers and audiences who were tired of seeing the same old stereotypes recycled on screen. The plot followed Sweetback, a man who witnesses injustice and decides to fight back against a system stacked against him. What made the movie explosive wasn't just the story, it was the way Van Peebles told it. He used handheld cameras, harsh lighting, and real locations to create an energy that felt raw and unstoppable. Mainstream critics dismissed it as too abrasive, too chaotic, but audiences saw something revolutionary. The film's marketing was just as defiant. Posters proudly proclaimed, "Rated X by an all-white jury." That line alone turned the movie into a rallying cry. It wasn't about polish, it was about power. The movie grossed millions at a time when major studios thought there was no money in films aimed squarely at black audiences. They were wrong. Sweetback not only made money, it rewrote the rules. Of course, controversy swirled around it. Some critics argued it glorified rebellion, others said it was irresponsible. But that noise only amplified its reach. By the time the dust settled, Sweetback's Baise-moi song had carved out a permanent place in film history. It wasn't just an exploitation film, it was a blueprint for the entire blaxploitation movement that followed. Without this movie, the landscape of 70s cinema would have looked very different. The Big Bird Cage, 1972. By the early 70s, the women in prison trend had become a gold mine, and the Big Bird Cage soared right into the middle of it. Directed by Jack Hill, and once again starring Pam Grier, this film mixed outrageous jungle adventure with rebellion, betrayal, and a healthy dose of chaotic energy. Where the Big Dollhouse felt tense and gritty, the Big Bird Cage leaned into the outrageous, almost cartoonish side of exploitation, and audiences absolutely loved it. The setup is wild. Grier plays Blossom, a tough revolutionary who plots with her lover to break a group of prisoners out of a brutal camp. The prison itself is bizarre, resembling a twisted work camp built in the middle of a swamp, complete with a massive birdcage-like contraption used to torment prisoners. The imagery alone was unforgettable, and the pacing made sure you never had time to catch your breath. Behind the camera, Jack Hill had already earned a reputation for turning small budgets into lightning-in-a-bottle entertainment. He knew exactly how to balance grit with humor, giving the film an unpredictable rhythm that kept audiences hooked. And once again, the Philippines became the backdrop, with its dense jungles adding a layer of authenticity no studio backlot could match. While critics dismissed it as another slice of exploitation trash, fans saw it differently. It wasn't trying to be art, it was trying to entertain, and it did that with style. Grier's performance as Blossom cemented her as a leading force in the genre, and the film's mix of action, rebellion, and spectacle made it one of the decade's most memorable grindhouse hits. For anyone exploring 70s exploitation, The Big Bird Cage is a must-see, wild, loud, and unashamed of every outrageous frame. The Thing with Two Heads, 1972. Sometimes exploitation cinema thrived on shock, but sometimes it thrived on sheer absurdity. The Thing with Two Heads is a perfect example. The premise alone could sell tickets. A wealthy, prejudiced surgeon learns he has a terminal condition. His solution? Experiment on himself. The result? He wakes up with his head grafted onto the body of a black man, played by former NFL star Rosie Grier. Yes, you heard that right. A buddy comedy and a social commentary, all in one outrageous package. On paper, it sounds ridiculous. On screen, it's even more unbelievable, but that's what made it unforgettable. The movie leaned hard into its bizarre setup, mixing slapstick humor with moments of biting social critique. Seeing two men forced to share one body became a not-so-subtle metaphor for the cultural clashes of the era. Audiences laughed, cringed, and, whether they admitted it or not, walked away thinking about the message buried under the chaos. The production embraced its low budget with gusto. Chase scenes featured Grier and co-star Ray Milland, literally trying to move in sync while sharing a single oversized shirt. It was clunky, it was awkward, and it was hilarious. Grindhouse audiences adored it because it was unlike anything else playing at the time. Critics, on the other hand, didn't hold back, calling it tasteless and absurd. But that criticism only added to its legend. Over the years, The Thing with Two Heads gained cult status precisely because it was so outrageous. It proved that exploitation films didn't need to be dark or gritty to push boundaries. Sometimes all it took was one outrageous idea executed with a straight face. And in the crowded landscape of 70s cinema, that was enough to make it stand out forever. Coffy, 1973. When you talk about the golden age of blaxploitation, one name towers above the rest: Pam Grier. And Coffy is the film that made her a legend. Released in 1973, it wasn't just another revenge story. It was a declaration that Grier could carry an entire movie on her shoulders. And she did it with more fire and grit than anyone had seen before. The story followed a woman who works as a nurse by day, but becomes a vigilante by night after seeing the people she cares about destroyed by corruption. That setup alone was enough to get attention, but what kept audiences hooked was Grier's electric performance. She wasn't playing a background character or a sidekick. She was the star, and every scene she was in demanded your attention. Director Jack Hill, who had already proven himself with The Big Bird Cage, gave Grier room to shine. He combined the grit of street-level crime with the slick pacing of a revenge thriller, creating a film that felt both outrageous and oddly grounded. The action sequences were raw, the energy was relentless, and the script gave Grier plenty of chances to show off her toughness. Critics at the time weren't sure what to do with it. Some dismissed it as pure exploitation, while others praised it for putting a strong woman at the center of a genre usually dominated by men. Audiences didn't care about the debate. They lined up, and the movie became a box office hit. Looking back, Coffy is more than just another gritty entry in the 70s exploitation wave. It was the moment when Pam Grier cemented herself as the face of the movement. She wasn't just part of the trend, she was the reason the trend worked. To this day, Coffy remains one of the most iconic revenge thrillers of its decade, proof that attitude and charisma can be more powerful than any big-budget spectacle. Foxy Brown, 1974. If Coffy made Pam Grier a star, Foxy Brown made her immortal. Released just a year later, this film doubled down on everything audiences loved about her earlier work and turned it up several notches. The result was a roller coaster of action, attitude, and righteous fury that still feels fierce nearly 50 years later. The story put Grier in the role of Foxy, a woman who infiltrates the criminal underworld after her boyfriend is targeted. It was revenge-fueled, it was stylish, and it was explosive. But what made Foxy Brown different was how it celebrated Grier's larger-than-life presence. She was bold, unapologetic, and unshakable, walking through scenes with the kind of confidence that made her an instant icon. Director Jack Hill once again worked his magic, keeping the pacing tight and the energy high. He wasn't afraid to go over the top, and audiences loved every second of it. Grindhouse theaters roared with approval as Grier outsmarted villains and took control of her own destiny. Of course, the critics didn't all cheer. Some called it cartoonish, others labeled it exploitative. But none of that mattered to the fans. To them, Foxy Brown was more than a character. She was a symbol of strength, resilience, and independence. She showed that a woman could lead an action movie, command the screen, and leave the audience cheering in her wake. In the years since, Foxy Brown has only grown in stature. It's been celebrated, parodied, and referenced countless times, proving its lasting cultural impact. For many, it remains the ultimate Pam Grier film, the one that solidified her as the queen of 70s exploitation. Switchblade Sisters, 1975. Gang dramas were nothing new in the 70s, but Jack Hill's Switchblade Sisters gave the formula a wild, unexpected twist. What if the gangs were all teenage girls? Released in 1975, this film wasn't about polished crime lords or slick street hustlers. It was about gritty, messy, emotional young women battling each other in a world that gave them no rules and no second chances. The movie followed Lace, the leader of a girl gang called the Dagger Debs, whose world unravels when betrayal, jealousy, and violence collide. What starts as a standard gang drama spirals into a Shakespearean tragedy, complete with shifting loyalties, unexpected twists, and explosive confrontations. Hill once again proved why he was one of exploitation's greatest directors. He gave the film an urban edge that felt both real and exaggerated at the same time. Shot on location in Los Angeles, the film leaned into the city's rough edges, creating a backdrop that was as dangerous as the characters themselves. Audiences who stumbled into grindhouses expecting cheap thrills were surprised by the intensity of the storytelling. The characters weren't one-note stereotypes. They were flawed, fiery, and unpredictable, which made the drama hit even harder. Critics didn't know what to make of it. Some dismissed it as trash, while others saw flashes of brilliance in its raw energy. Over the decades, Switchblade Sisters has developed a loyal cult following. Directors like Quentin Tarantino have praised it for its audacity, and modern viewers recognize it as one of the most daring female-driven exploitation films of its time. It wasn't polished, it wasn't pretty, but it was unforgettable. And, in the end, that's exactly what 70s exploitation was all about. Ilsa, Harem Keeper of the Oil Sheiks, 1976. If the original Ilsa, she-wolf of the SS, shocked audiences, its follow-up, Ilsa, Harem Keeper of the Oil Sheiks, pushed things into even stranger territory. Released in 1976, this sequel transported the notorious character out of war camps and into the desert, where she ran a harem for a wealthy ruler. The change of scenery didn't soften the edges. Instead, It gave the filmmakers license to go even wilder with their storytelling. The character of Ilsa, once again played by Diane Thorne, remained as ruthless and unflinching as ever. Surrounded by gold, sand, and endless luxury, she orchestrated a twisted empire where control was everything. The setting itself made the film stand out. Instead of the bleak gray of prison camps, the story unfolded against sun-drenched palaces and endless desert landscapes. That contrast made the shocking moments even more pronounced. Production was fast, cheap, and geared toward the grindhouse circuit. Shot on location in California, with sets dressed to mimic the Middle East, the movie leaned on bright colors and exotic costumes to set the tone. While mainstream critics were quick to dismiss it, audiences hungry for over-the-top spectacle kept it alive in midnight screenings. Over time, Harem Keeper of the Oil Sheiks became a cult favorite precisely because of how audacious it was. Sequels often play it safe, but this one doubled down on excess. It may not have the infamy of the original, but in the world of exploitation, it's remembered as proof that if a formula worked once, filmmakers of the 70s weren't afraid to crank the volume even higher the second time around. Taxi Zum Klo, 1976. Few films from the 70s were as unfiltered and personal as Taxi Zum Klo. This German independent feature took audiences into the underground culture of Berlin and refused to look away. Director Frank Riplow not only wrote and directed it, he starred in it, playing a version of himself navigating daily life with all its complications, frustrations, and small triumphs. What made the film stand out was its raw honesty. Unlike Hollywood dramas, Taxi Zum Klo didn't glamorize its subject matter. Instead, it leaned into realism, using handheld cameras and real locations to create a sense of authenticity. Audiences felt like they were watching slices of real life rather than scripted performances. That approach rattled mainstream critics but gave the film a lasting sense of credibility. While not an American grindhouse title, its spirit fit perfectly into the exploitation category because it rejected mainstream polish and presented something unfiltered. The movie became a lightning rod for debate across Europe, with some calling it groundbreaking and others calling it irresponsible. In the United States, it was circulated on the art house and underground circuit, where curious audiences quickly gave it cult status. Over the years, Taxi Zum Klo has been revisited as a piece of 70s cinema that dared to challenge comfort zones. It didn't rely on flashy gimmicks, elaborate violence, or exaggerated characters. Instead, it relied on unflinching honesty. And, in its own way, that made it one of the boldest exploitation films of its decade. Death Race 2000, 1975. Leave it to producer Roger Corman to turn something outrageous into a cultural phenomenon. Death Race 2000, released in 1975, imagined a dystopian future where cross-country car races weren't about speed, they were about spectacle. Drivers competed not only to win, but to rack up points by causing chaos along the way. It was satire, it was absurd, and it was unforgettable. Directed by Paul Bartel, the film combined fast cars, colorful costumes, and a dark sense of humor. David Carradine played the mysterious racer Frankenstein, while a young Sylvester Stallone showed up as his brash rival long before Rocky made him a household name. The casting gave the film instant charisma, but it was the premise that turned heads. A future where violence was televised as entertainment didn't just feel shocking, it felt uncomfortably possible. The production leaned on Corman's trademark efficiency. With a limited budget, the crew used inventive tricks to make the race scenes look grander than they were. Real highways in California doubled as futuristic tracks, and custom-built cars became characters of their own. Critics were split. Some saw it as trashy fun. Others recognized the biting satire beneath the chaos. Fans, however, embraced it wholeheartedly. Grindhouse theaters roared with approval, and the movie became a cult classic almost overnight. Today, Death Race 2000 is remembered as more than just an exploitation curiosity. It's seen as sharp social commentary, wrapped in outrageous spectacle. In a decade where filmmakers constantly asked how far cinema could go, this movie answered, as far as your imagination will take you, even if it means turning a car race into a wild metaphor for society's hunger for spectacle. Rolling Thunder, 1977. By the late 70s, America was still wrestling with the aftermath of Vietnam, and few films captured that sense of anger and alienation like Rolling Thunder. Directed by John Flynn and co-written by Paul Schrader, this film blurred the line between exploitation and serious drama, combining psychological tension with explosive payback. On the surface, it was a revenge story. Underneath, it was about a broken country trying to make sense of itself. The plot followed Major Charles Rain, played by William Devane, a war veteran returning home after years in captivity. At first, his small Texas town greets him as a hero, but beneath the parades and polite smiles, there's a deep unease. Rain himself is scarred, emotionally detached, and struggling to fit back into civilian life. When his home is attacked and his family torn apart, he finds himself pulled into a spiral that pushes him toward brutal retribution. What set Rolling Thunder apart was its tone. It wasn't loud or cartoonish like many exploitation titles. Instead, it simmered with quiet rage. Flynn shot it with restraint, letting silence and stillness build dread before unleashing sudden, shocking bursts of action. Devane gave a haunting performance, while Tommy Lee Jones, in an early role, brought a chilling intensity to the film's final act. At the time, critics were divided. Some dismissed it as just another grindhouse revenge flick, while others saw the layers of social commentary beneath the surface. Audiences in grindhouses, however, immediately recognized its raw power. Over the years, it has gained a reputation as one of the most emotionally charged revenge films of the decade. Rolling Thunder may not have had the flashy spectacle of other 70s exploitation titles, but it cut deeper. It showed that exploitation didn't always need to be outrageous to push boundaries. Sometimes all it took was holding up a mirror to a society still reeling from war and asking, what happens when the heroes come home and no one really knows what to do with them? The 70s was the decade when cinema tore up the rulebook and dared to ask how far a movie could really go. From wild prison breakouts to surreal car races and raw revenge stories, these exploitation films didn't just cross lines, they erased them, and decades later, they're still making jaws drop. Which of these outrageous titles would you dare to sit through today? Drop your pick in the comments, hit subscribe for more deep dives, and keep exploring the wild side of cinema. The 1970s were a decade when cinema didn't just flirt with controversy. It slammed the door open, stomped inside, and dared you to look away. These weren't safe movies made for polite company. They were raw, unruly, and sometimes downright dangerous. Studio bosses couldn't control them, censors tried to kill them, and audiences lined up anyway. So, how far could a film really go before it crossed the line? You're about to find out, and some of these will still make your jaw drop. Ilsa, She-Wolf of the SS, 1975. Few exploitation films from the 70s carry the same notorious reputation as Ilsa, She-Wolf of the SS. Shot quickly on leftover sets from the TV sitcom Hogan's Heroes, this low-budget Canadian production was aimed directly at the U.S. grindhouse market, and it hit like a grenade. Diane Thorne plays Ilsa, a brutal camp commandant obsessed with proving women could endure more pain than men. The result is a string of twisted experiments and ruthless punishment for anyone who crosses her. Made for about $150,000, it exploded in drive-ins and midnight screenings, pulling in millions despite being banned in countries like Australia, Germany, and New Zealand. Critics shredded it, calling it tasteless and grotesque. Some of the cast and crew even tried to have their names removed from the credits after release. Of course, the backlash only made audiences hungrier to see it. The controversy turned Ilsa into a brand, spawning sequels and cementing its place in grindhouse history. Whether you see it as a sick fantasy or a raw time capsule of 70s boundary-pushing cinema, one thing's certain, it's impossible to forget once you've seen it. The Last House on the Left, 1972. Wes Craven's first film didn't just push boundaries, it bulldozed them. The Last House on the Left follows two teenage girls headed to a concert who cross paths with a gang of escaped convicts. What starts as a kidnapping spirals into a harrowing ordeal that shocked audiences and censors alike. The real sting comes when the tables turn and the parents of one victim serve up their own brand of justice. Made for around $90,000, this raw, grainy feature was marketed with the infamous line, "To avoid fainting, keep repeating, it's only a movie. In the UK, it was outright banned in 1974, dragged into the video nasties panic years later, and stayed banned well into the 2000s. Early screenings reportedly caused fainting, walkouts, and even illness. Craven later admitted he never expected such outrage, but he tapped into something primal. Without polished effects or big-budget gloss, the film's gritty realism made it feel like something you weren't supposed to see. Love it or hate it, it became a blueprint for revenge thrillers, and a reminder that horror can hit hardest when it feels all too real. I Spit on Your Grave, 1978. When I Spit on Your Grave landed in theaters, it was met with disgust, protests, and scathing reviews. Camille Keaton plays a young writer who retreats to a rural cabin to work, only to be attacked and left for dead by local men. What follows is a relentless revenge mission that stunned even hardened grindhouse audiences. Director Mir Zarchi said the idea came from helping a real assault victim get to the police and seeing her mistreated there. No studio wanted it, so Zarchi rented theaters himself, keeping ticket sales. Critics tore it apart, with Roger Ebert calling it a vile bag of garbage, yet it grossed over $5 million on a shoestring budget. In some countries, it was banned outright for decades. In the UK, it bounced on and off the banned list, with uncut versions only appearing much later. Its legacy is divisive. Some see it as exploitation at its ugliest, others as a raw tale of survival and revenge. Either way, it's one of the most infamous titles in 70s grindhouse history. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 1974. Tobe Hooper's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre proved you don't need buckets of gore to terrify an audience. Following a group of friends who stumble into a rural nightmare run by the Leatherface family, the film's power comes from its suffocating atmosphere and unrelenting tension. Made for about $140,000, it went on to earn over $30 million in the US alone. The MPAA refused an R rating, and several countries banned it outright. In the UK, the ban stuck for decades, and they even outlawed the word chainsaw from film titles during that period. Despite showing very little blood, the constant screaming, chaotic editing, and grimy look made it feel more brutal than most gore-heavy films. Hooper's low-budget ingenuity turned Texas Chainsaw into one of the most profitable independent films ever made, and the godfather of modern slashers. Many imitated it, but few matched its raw, nerve-shredding energy. Faces of Death, 1978. In an era where horror was already pushing limits, Faces of Death dared to present itself as a documentary. Marketed as a study of death around the world, it mixed staged scenes with real footage of accidents, disasters, and animal attacks. The result? Outrage, bans, and an underground cult following. Director John Allen Schwartz spent around $450,000 making it. Special effects wizard Alan Apone, later of Scarface and Iron Man, handled the fake gore, which was convincing enough to fool many viewers. Authorities weren't amused. It was banned in the UK, Australia, and New Zealand, with possession of an uncut copy even considered a criminal offense in some places. Despite the controversy, or perhaps because of it, Faces of Death became a VHS legend. Bootlegs circulated in schoolyards, and midnight screenings sold out. The taboo of watching something so forbidden made it irresistible to many. It's not for everyone, but it's a prime example of how 70s exploitation could blur the line between fiction and reality in ways that still spark debate. Fight for Your Life, 1977. Even among grindhouse regulars, Fight for Your Life stood out as one of the most racially charged exploitation films ever made. The plot is simple but explosive. 3 escaped convicts invade the home of a black minister and hold his family hostage. What follows is a tense, hate-filled standoff that pushes every button imaginable. Banned outright in the UK in 1981, it was labeled so offensive that the British Board of Film Classification refused to even consider cuts. An uncut VHS briefly surfaced in 1982 before being yanked during the height of the video nasty crackdown. Other countries weren't any more forgiving, and even in the US, some theaters wouldn't touch it. Director Robert Endelson said he made it for audiences, not critics, and he succeeded in provoking a visceral reaction. The villains are irredeemable, the violence is ugly, and there's no comic relief to soften the blows. Quentin Tarantino once called it one of the meanest exploitation films he'd ever seen. For those who can stomach it, it's a raw reminder of just how far 70s cinema was willing to go to test its viewers. Super Vixens, 1975. Russ Meyer was already a legend in exploitation cinema. But Super Vixens might be his most outrageous creation. Part violent road movie, part cartoon come to life, it follows Clint, a gas station attendant framed for murder who meets a series of over-the-top women, all played by the same actress in different costumes and wigs. Meyer financed the $100,000 budget himself and somehow convinced 20th Century Fox's indie division to distribute it, despite the X rating. The gamble paid off. It grossed around $17 million worldwide, an incredible return for a film this wild. One of the most notorious moments involves a police officer killing a woman in a bathtub, followed by electrocution, a scene Tarantino has praised as one of the most powerful in 70s cinema. Meyer described the film as a violent adult cartoon, and that's exactly what it feels like. Exaggerated characters, lurid colors, and bursts of shocking brutality. Love it or hate it, Super Vixens proved that in the 70s, audacity could be a box office goldmine. Caged Heat, 1974. Before Jonathan Demme won Oscars for The Silence of the Lambs, he cut his teeth on Caged Heat, a women-in-prison exploitation flick made for Roger Corman's New World Pictures. The setup is pure grindhouse. A group of inmates endure a sadistic warden and a corrupt doctor until they've had enough and plan a breakout. Shot in abandoned asylums around Los Angeles, the film cost around $180,000 and grossed over $2 million, a massive profit for Corman's outfit. Demme, working with no budget, edited it himself under a fake name. The result is campy, raw, and brimming with the expected genre staples: power struggles, betrayal, and explosive payback. While it was dismissed by mainstream critics at the time, Caged Heat has since earned a cult following, even getting praise from Francis Ford Coppola as one of the best exploitation films ever made. It's proof that in the 70s, even future Hollywood heavyweights had to start by getting their hands dirty in the grindhouse circuit. Bloodsucking Freaks, 1976. Few titles match their content as perfectly as Bloodsucking Freaks. Set in a grimy off-Broadway theater, it follows a sadistic magician and his assistant who kidnap people and perform grotesque acts for a paying audience. When it was released, critics loathed it. The MPAA slapped on an X rating, and several U.S. cities banned it outright. But word of mouth kept it alive in grindhouses and midnight screenings, where audiences were either laughing nervously or sitting in stunned silence. Made for just $100,000, it later found a second life when Trauma Entertainment picked it up in the 2000s, adding a commentary track from director Joel Reed and even Eli Roth. Some argue it has a layer of social commentary buried under the outrageous gore and cruelty, but for most viewers, it's simply one of the most over-the-top exploitation films ever made. If the goal was to shock, Bloodsucking Freaks succeeded in ways few films have matched. Black Mama, White Mama, 1973. Take two rival prisoners, chain them together, and throw them into a jungle war zone. That's Black Mama, White Mama in a nutshell. Pam Grier plays a tough, streetwise inmate, while Margaret Markoff is the political prisoner she's forced to escape with. They hate each other, but survival means cooperation. Shot in the Philippines on a shoestring budget, the film was part of New World Pictures' push into overseas locations where production costs were rock bottom. The climate was brutal, the stunts were improvised, and Grier reportedly did many of her own action scenes. The mix of prison drama, chase thriller, and jungle warfare gave it a fresh twist compared to other women-in-prison films of the era. In the US, it played to grindhouse crowds hungry for action and attitude, and it delivered both. While it didn't make massive box office numbers, it became a cult hit on VHS, thanks to Grier's commanding screen presence and the constant, unpredictable danger of the plot. It's a perfect example of how 70s exploitation loved to mash genres into one chaotic ride. Ms. 45, 1979. Abel Ferrara's Ms. 45 is a gritty, grimy revenge thriller set in New York's crumbling streets at the end of the 70s. Zoe Lund plays Thana, a mute seamstress who becomes a vigilante after being pushed past her breaking point. With no dialogue, Lund communicates everything through expression, making her transformation into a cold, calculating avenger even more chilling. Shot guerrilla style without permits, the film captured the real decay and danger of late 70s Manhattan. The budget was tiny, and many of the extras were just people on the street who wandered into the frame. Ferrara, under a fake name, even plays one of the attackers himself. While it technically came out right at the turn of the decade, it's pure 70s in style and tone, raw, unapologetic, and unapologetically urban. Though heavily cut in some markets, it gained a loyal cult audience on home video. Ms. 45 remains one of Ferrara's most powerful works, proving that exploitation can carry genuine artistry without losing its edge. Mako, The Jaws of Death, 1976. Capitalizing on the shark craze after Jaws, Mako, The Jaws of Death took a different approach, making the shark the good guy. Richard Jekyll stars as a man who can communicate with sharks telepathically, defending them from exploitation by humans. Naturally, the humans don't listen, and the body count rises. Filmed in Florida with real sharks, the production leaned on the novelty of underwater stunt work and the animal connection. The plot might sound strange, but the film had an environmental streak rare for exploitation at the time, portraying the sharks as victims rather than monsters. While it never matched Jaws in box office, it carved out its own niche on the drive-in circuit. Today, it's remembered as one of the weirder entries in the 70s animal attack boom, part revenge story, part ecological fable, and all exploitation attitude. Welcome Home, Brother Charles, 1975. Jama Fanaka's Welcome Home, Brother Charles is one of the most unusual entries in the blaxploitation wave. It follows Charles, a man wrongly imprisoned who, after his release, seeks revenge on the corrupt officials who put him there. What sets it apart is its jaw-dropping twist on how Charles carries out that revenge, a detail that became the film's infamous calling card. Made while Fanaka was still a student at UCLA, the film was shot for very little money but still managed to get theatrical distribution. It mixes gritty social commentary with pure grindhouse sensationalism, touching on themes of police corruption, racial injustice, and survival in an unforgiving world. It wasn't a massive hit, but it earned enough of a reputation to keep Fanaka working in the industry. Today, it's remembered as a bizarre blend of serious intent and outrageous execution, exactly the kind of combination that kept 70s exploitation cinema unpredictable. Mansion of the Doomed, 1976. Charles Band's Mansion of the Doomed is a low-budget horror gem that feels like a grim fairy tale gone wrong. Richard Basehart plays a brilliant but unhinged eye surgeon who becomes obsessed with restoring his daughter's sight after an accident blinds her. His solution? Kidnap people, remove their eyes, and transplant them into her. Shot quickly to keep costs down, the film used stark lighting and claustrophobic sets to amplify its sense of dread. The victims are kept alive in a dark basement, stumbling blindly while the doctor searches for better replacements. For a small movie, the atmosphere is surprisingly intense, and the practical effects are unnerving without relying on excess gore. While it flew under the radar compared to flashier exploitation titles, Mansion of the Doomed gained a cult following on VHS for its creepy premise and disturbing imagery. It's proof that 70s exploitation didn't need huge shocks to leave an impression. Sometimes a single twisted idea was enough. Sisters, 1972. Before Carrie and Dressed to Kill, Brian De Palma delivered Sisters, a tense psychological thriller that blends Hitchcock-style suspense with 70s grit. Margot Kidder plays a model with a dark secret involving her twin sister, a secret that bursts into violence when a reporter witnesses a brutal murder in her apartment. Shot for about $500,000, the film made clever use of split-screen effects to heighten the tension, a De Palma trademark. Critics praised its stylish direction, but were startled by its graphic moments, which were uncommon in mainstream thrillers at the time. While it didn't face outright bans, Sisters pushed boundaries by mixing art house aesthetics with exploitation-level shocks. It's a reminder that during the 70s, the line between serious cinema and grindhouse thrills was often razor-thin and sometimes non-existent. The Candy Snatchers, 1973. The Candy Snatchers starts like a straightforward crime thriller and slowly mutates into one of the nastiest exploitation films of its decade. Three criminals kidnap a teenage girl and bury her alive in a coffin, planning to ransom her to her wealthy stepfather. But greed, betrayal, and incompetence spiral everything out of control. Shot in Los Angeles, the film had a gritty, almost documentary feel. Its outdoor locations, unpolished look, and unflinching violence made it stand out. There's no glamour here. The kidnappers are desperate and messy, the victim is genuinely terrified, and the heroes never show up. The ending is pure gut punch, leaving audiences stunned and critics divided. It didn't get much theatrical play, but became a cult hit decades decades later when home video finally gave it the audience it deserved. This is the kind of movie that makes you realize 70s exploitation didn't care about happy endings. It cared about impact. Don't Go in the House, 1979. If Psycho had been remade in the grimy late 70s, it might look like Don't Go in the House. Dan Grimaldi plays a socially awkward man who, after years of abuse from his mother, begins luring women into a specially built metal room and setting them on fire with a flamethrower. Shot in New Jersey for a small budget, the film leaned heavily on its disturbing set pieces. The metallic kill room, with chains hanging from the walls, became its most iconic image. The MPAA slapped it with an X rating until cuts were made, and it was banned outright in some countries. While it borrowed from the slasher formula that was gaining momentum, its focus on psychological breakdown and fire-based horror gave it a unique edge. Today, it stands as one of the most unsettling lone killer movies of its era, proof that late 70s exploitation could still shock audiences jaded by years of on-screen violence. The Witch Who Came from the Sea, 1976. This surreal, unsettling film from director Matt Cimber tells the story of Molly, a woman whose traumatic past fuels a series of violent acts against men she sees as predatory. Played with eerie calm by Millie Perkins, Molly is both sympathetic and terrifying, a character who keeps you guessing until the end. Shot on the cheap, the movie's dreamlike quality comes from washed-out cinematography and disjointed editing, giving it the feel of a waking nightmare. While it doesn't rely on constant action, its bursts of violence are jarring enough to have gotten it caught up in the UK's video nasty panic, where it was banned for years. Critics at the time didn't know what to make of it. Some saw it as exploitation trash, others as an artful meditation on trauma and violence. It's since been reappraised as one of the strangest, most original entries in the 70s exploitation canon, proving that the genre wasn't afraid to get weird. Deathbed, The Bed That Eats, 1977. It sounds like a joke, but Deathbed, The Bed That Eats is a real film, and that's exactly what makes it legendary. The premise is right there in the title. A cursed bed consumes anyone who lies on it, dissolving them in a strange, bubbling acid. It's absurd, eerie, and completely unlike anything else from the 70s exploitation scene. Shot in Detroit for an almost non-existent budget, the movie mixes horror with surreal humor. The effects are primitive but imaginative, including the use of thick, colored liquids to simulate the bed's digestive process. It was never widely released in the 70s, instead circulating quietly in the underground tape-trading world years later. What makes Deathbed special isn't just the ridiculous plot, but the fact that it treats the premise with straight-faced sincerity. It's an oddball reminder that the 70s grindhouse circuit welcomed just about any idea, no matter how strange, as long as it could grab your attention. Frightmare, 1974. From the UK's Pete Walker, Frightmare is one of the creepiest British exploitation films of the decade. It follows a seemingly harmless elderly couple living in the countryside. The truth? The wife has a habit of killing and eating people who come to their home. Walker was known for pushing British censorship to its limit, and this one tested every boundary. The violence is grim, but the real unease comes from the slow reveal, the idea that someone so outwardly normal could be hiding something monstrous. While it didn't get banned outright, it faced heavy criticism from the British press, who saw it as part of a wave of depraved horror movies corrupting the youth. Over time, it's become a cult favorite, showing that not all exploitation needed chaos and noise. Sometimes quiet menace was more disturbing. House of Whipcord, 1974. Another Pete Walker shocker, House of Whipcord takes the women in prison setup and twists it into a tale of moral fanaticism. A young model is lured to a remote estate where a retired prison governor and his equally rigid wife run their own private detention center for immoral women. Filmed for very little money, Walker leaned on stark, almost gothic visuals to make the story more unsettling. There's no supernatural angle here, just human cruelty and an unshakable belief that they're doing the right thing. It stirred controversy in Britain for its unflinching treatment of punishment and abuse, but also gained praise from some critics for its suspense and atmosphere. As a final entry on this list, House of Whipcord shows how 70s exploitation could work without constant action by building a chilling world you wouldn't want to visit. The 1970s were a wild frontier for filmmaking, a decade when low budgets, bold ideas, and complete disregard for the rules created movies that couldn't exist in any other time. Some were brutal, some were bizarre, and some were just plain dangerous to watch. Whether banned, protested, or whispered about in midnight screenings, these films didn't just push the limits, they tore them down. Which of these notorious titles would you dare to sit through? Drop your answer in the comments, hit subscribe for more deep dives, and keep exploring the wild side of cinema.